Podcasting has exploded in the last few years, with listenership increasing every year and also the number of podcasts on the podcastosphere. And a lot of people want to get started with their own podcast, but aren't really aware of some of the basics of podcasting, which is probably preventing them from getting started with their own podcast. In this episode, which is the first of a series of episodes that I'm doing on the basics of podcasting, we'll be talking about what exactly is podcasting, how does it work, some of the technical aspects of it, and how it differs from a lot of the other content creation platforms. If you're new to podcasting and you're looking to get started with your podcast, then this is where you need to get started. You'll be able to find all of the other videos that I'm creating in this series in the playlist on how to start a podcast. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you're new here and if you don't know me, then I am a podcaster, blogger and affiliate marketer. I run the popular podcasting tips related show called as the Podcasting University, where I talk about a lot of practical and implementable tips about podcasting. And if you're new to this channel, then here I share a lot of those practical videos which can help you with your podcasting. So if you're new here, then you might want to subscribe to this channel and click the bell notification so that you stay updated with all of the latest episodes that I release here. And if you're planning to get started with your own podcast and you don't know where to get started with your show, then you can join my free 10-day course on how to start a podcast. You'll be able to find a link to this course in the description below, or you can even visit thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide and join the course today. It's a 10-day free e-course and you will learn everything that you need to get started with your own podcast. On to today's episode. What is podcasting? How does it work? And how does it differ from a lot of the other content creation platforms? In this video, I'm going to cover some of the basic technical aspects of podcasting so that you understand how to get started with your own podcast and what are some of the basic things that you need to keep in mind when you are starting with podcast. But first of all, let's understand what podcasting is all about. Now, podcasting is an on-demand audio content. On demand because you can listen to it whenever you want. Unlike the conventional radio where it is broadcasted, you have to tune into that particular broadcast at that time if you want to listen to it. But in podcasting, this audio is something that you can listen to as and when you want. So it is called as on-demand audio. And how did podcasts start? If I am to look at the history of podcasting, somewhere around the late 1900s or maybe the early 2000s, a lot of bloggers had started creating a lot of audio blogs and they were calling it as audio blogs. Even I started creating a lot of audio blogs somewhere around 2009-2010. But from what I know, 2010 is when that term called as podcast was coined. And thanks to Apple and its iPods, podcasting became a popular medium of consuming audio content for a lot of people, primarily through the iPod. But now things have changed and podcasting is available on almost all platforms, even if it is Android, Windows, and there are different distribution networks that distribute podcasts for their listeners, like Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Prime Music. So all of these channels have now popularized podcast and you can just tune into any of them and search for your favorite podcast and listen to it. So podcast has been simplified a lot since 2010 when that particular term called as podcast was coined. How does podcasting work and how is it different from a lot of the other content creation platforms? Now, we've seen how blogs work. It is all about putting together a website that is called as a blog and publishing posts on that particular website every week or whatever your frequency is. You write a piece of content and publish it. And then you ensure that you're optimizing that for search engines so that your blog post gets ranked on the search engines and people who are searching for it see that and click on that, come to your blog and read the blog post. Now, when you look at videos, creating a video is a little more simpler because you just need to record the video, do some basic edits that you want to do, and then you can upload it to one of these video sharing platforms, like for example YouTube, which is the most popular video sharing platform. There are a lot of other such platforms as well. You can upload this video to one of these video sharing platforms and your video is available to watch for all of your audiences who are coming to those platforms, searching for specific videos and watching it. But when it comes to podcasting has a slightly different way of making that particular audio content available to its listeners. Podcasts work on something called as RSS, or it is called as really simple syndication. We don't need to get into the technical aspects of what an RSS is, but it is a weird looking URL that basically has all of the feed, which means it will have all of the details of every episode that you publish on your podcast, and also some of the basic aspects of what your podcast is all about, like for example the title, description, the tags and everything. Now this RSS feed is a typical feed that can only be created by a podcast host. So if you're looking to get started with your podcast and you think that I'll record an audio and put it out there and people will be able to listen to it, that is not how it is going to work. You cannot distribute that audio file to the podcasting platforms or to the podcasting directories. You will need a podcast host. Now, podcast host is somebody who will be able to generate this RSS feed for you. There are a lot of podcast hosts out there, and some of the prominent ones are Blueberry, Libsyn, Buzzsprout, Acast. I use Acast to host my podcast. It's an amazing platform. You have a free plan. You can start off for free, and there are premium plans as well, which will give you added benefits. Similarly, a lot of the other platforms also have free plans, but when it comes to Buzzsprout, Libsyn and Blueberry, they have only premium plans. But you can pick whatever host you want and use it to host your podcast. Now, once you've signed up with one of these hosts, all that you need to do is just enter some of the basic details of your podcast. Like for example, what is the name of your podcast? You will need to enter a small description of what the podcast is all about. You will need to create a small artwork, which is a square graphic for about 3000 pixel by 3000 pixel, which basically shows what your podcast is all about. Now, these are some of the basic things that you will need to provide your podcast host. Once that is done, you can start recording your audio and uploading it onto this host. Now, recording and uploading is pretty easy. Most of these podcast hosts have an online recording tool. You can use that as well. But I would recommend going with a dedicated recording and editing tool like that of Audacity, which is free to download. So you will have to download this tool and you will have to record into that tool. Or if you want, you can even use your mobile phone as well. But Audacity is the best tool to get started with. So you record into this tool, edit it and mix it if you want to add audio, start at the beginning of the podcast or towards the end of the podcast. So you do all of that, and once you've generated the MP3 file from this audio editor, all that you need to do is just upload it to the podcast host. And when you upload it to the podcast host, your podcast host will give you an RSS feed. So that is all about RSS feed. Now, it can sound a little technical, little too technical and very typical, but it is pretty simple. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is that unlike blogging or videos, podcasting requires you to sign up with a podcast host, and you will need to create your audio files, your episodes, and submit it to this podcast host. So what happens after you have submitted your podcast to the podcast host? Now, most of the podcast hosting companies have a lot of support in terms of distributing and promoting your podcast. So once you've uploaded your audio to a podcast host, people cannot just start listening to your podcast, because these podcasts need to be made available on podcast directories. Now, that is another aspect which is different from that of blogging and vlogging or video creation. Now, when it comes to blogging, your blog is on your website or your blog, and it is indexed by search engines, and people search for typical information on Google or other search engines and find your blog. In videos, all that you need to do is just create your video and upload it to a video distribution platform like that of YouTube. So people can come to YouTube and view your videos. But when it comes to podcasting, podcasts can only be listened on podcast listening platforms. Now, there are a lot of these prominent podcast listening platforms, but some of the most prominent ones are Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Now, these are 3 podcast listening platforms where your podcast needs to be there if you want to build an audience. But can you submit your podcast directly to either Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify? No, you cannot, because they index the RSS feed that you have submitted to your podcast host. And it is from this RSS feed that they will generate the information of every episode that you're releasing, and they will update their platforms with the latest episodes that you're releasing. So, how will the distribution to these platforms happen? This distribution happens from your podcast host. What is it that you need to do to distribute your podcast to these podcast listening platforms? With the latest technology and with most podcast hosting companies providing a lot of features to their customers, this distribution pretty much happens automatically, because these podcast hosting companies have an automatic distribution to these podcast listening platforms. In some cases, you might have to go and manually submit that RSS feed to a directory, like for example in the case of Apple Podcasts, but it is pretty simple, and your podcast hosting company will give you a step-by-step guide on how to go about submitting this RSS feed to that particular podcast listening platform or to that podcast directory. You might see that I'm using 2 typical terms here, which is podcast directory and podcast listening app. Now, podcast directory is like that of a telephone directory, where it has all of the podcasts in the podcastosphere listed, and you can go and search and pick podcasts and listen to it. Now, a lot of these podcast directories also act as podcast listening platforms. You can directly listen to the podcast on that particular app itself. And these days, most podcast directories double up as a podcast listening app. But because the most prominent ones are Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, those are the 3 directories that, or listening apps, that we will primarily be focusing on. Once your RSS feed is submitted to these podcast directories, they will index your podcast and keep updating your podcast with the latest episodes that you release. So once you have submitted this to these podcast directories, your job of distribution is done, which means that every time that you release a podcast episode, you don't need to go to these directories and update it. All of that gets automatically updated, and that is all done by your podcast hosting company. And that is where the podcast hosting company plays a big role. So from a creation perspective, all that you're doing is creating an audio file and then submitting it to a podcast hosting company or a podcast host, who then creates the RSS feed, which is then submitted to the podcast directories, who then make it available for your listeners to listen to your podcast episodes. That is the basics of podcasting and all that is there to getting started with your podcast. But there are other aspects in podcasting, like for example, promoting your podcast and bringing in new listeners, what are the equipments that are required, and a lot of these other aspects which we'll be covering in our next videos. But for this video, I just wanted to give you a general information about what is podcasting and how does a podcast work. And if you have any questions around what we discussed in this today's episode, you can always drop that in the comment below and I would be more than happy to respond to that. From a podcasting perspective, I think I covered pretty much everything from the basics of podcasting or from what podcasting is or how it works. And I hope that this video was useful to you. If you liked this video, then don't forget to give a thumbs up to this video because it will help in other people finding this video. And in the series that I'm going to create on podcasting, I'll be further creating some of the other aspects of podcasting, like for example, podcast hosts, what are the right equipments to get started with, how to promote your podcast, how to monetize your podcast, and all of these aspects. Don't forget to check out the playlist on how to start a podcast, which is where I'll be clubbing all of these videos together. If you're new to podcasting and want to get started with your own podcast, then you can join my free 10-day course on how to start a podcast. You'll be able to find the link in the description below. Go ahead, click the link and get started with your own podcast. And if you're new to this channel, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification. That way you will be notified every time I release a new video here. That's all that I have for today's video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting conversation around podcasting. Until then, keep watching TPU TV. This is goodbye from Dilip.